the fact that we've delayed for about some few minutes. We are sorry due to some technical problems we needed to solve. So let me begin by saying a very big welcome to everybody, both people in-house and those online. As always, we cherish your presence. So thank you so much for joining us today for the IAS seminar series. As I announced last week, today promises to be another very exciting presentation. So without taking too much time, as we've already lost some time, I would straightforward go to introduce our chair for today's talk. And of course, I must say, I dare not try to give the profile of Prof. Adomako-Ampofo at this particular point in time. So I'll briefly say just a sentence or two about her, and she takes over the proceeding. So Prof. Adomako-Ampofo is a professor of African and gender studies here at the Institute of Studies. And we are proud to say that she was recently appointed as Wangari Maathai visiting professor at the University of Kassel, Germany, to which we say a very big congratulations. We are proud to be a flag. All right, so Prof, I immediately hand over to you as you take over today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asiatu, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming again. To those of you online also, thank you very much and you're welcome. Today's speaker I have known for a while. I'm not sure exactly how long. I believe we met through the Women's Caucus of the African Studies Association. She's still a young woman, but she was a little younger than as was I, obviously. But it's really a great pleasure to have her here. Our speaker for today is Jacqueline-Bethel Tchouta Mougoue. She is a feisty young woman. She has been formidable in the Women's Caucus and just stepped down a year ago as co-convener. So done a lot of work in a lot of the circles that and spaces that I also inhabit. She's currently an associate professor of African Cultural Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and also affiliated with the Department of History and the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the author of a number of texts, but most recently the prize-winning book, Gender, Separatist Politics, and Embodied Nationalism in Cameroon, which was published by University of Michigan Press in 2019. This afternoon, we're going to hear her speak on the subject, Esther Dreams, Pan-African Lives, Racial Politics, and Belonging in Africa. And I am sure that you all, as I, are very much looking forward to hearing this talk. So let's give her a warm welcome with some. So you're very welcome, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, thank you. Before I begin, let me just share my screen here. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Thank you, Professor. We actually took a very long train ride in Morocco together for 8 hours where we got to be closer friends. So thank you for hosting me today. Thank you to IAAS for inviting me and for hosting me as well. I'm very grateful. What I want to do today is give you a brief outline of my current project and highlight two of its chapters that focus on African-born women and their Black American counterparts. Specifically, I want to briefly sketch out the book, the main arguments, and explain the goal of the two chapters that I'm writing while here. I first uncovered the traces of my current book project when working on my recently published book. I was looking through the sources that I had photocopied from Cameroon's archives when I came upon the name Enoch Olinga and the word Baha'i. I didn't know who Enoch Olinga was, but I knew by his name that he was not from Cameroon. Not sure what to make of the sources, I put them aside for about 7 to 8 years. But after some time, I returned to the sources. I started to ask colleagues about who this mysterious Enoch Linga was and what Baha'i was. This colleague who focused on Ugandan history soon connected me to someone in Cameroon who happened to have been named after Enoch Olinga. This man's name is Enoch Tani, who is here today on Zoom from Cameroon. He opened the doors to my research. I soon learned that in 1953, 3 Ugandans sent out in a Peugeot station wagon on a 2-month mission across Africa. All were recent converts to the Baha'i faith, a religion founded in 19th century Iran that has spread to Uganda. The first stayed in the Republic of Congo, the second in the Central African Free Republic, and the last, the mysterious 27-year-old Enoch Olinga, continued on to Cameroon. And here's a map. So imagine this bus going across Western Africa. Once there, Enoch Olinga quickly became the leader of a small community of Baha'i believers, including local Africans and Black Americans. He later married a Cameroonian woman. With Baha'i theology and expansion a backdrop, a historical setting rather than a focus, my second book project explores how Olinga and his new friends spread their new faith teaching about racial harmony and human unity in Western Africa, such as in Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Cameroon, of course. My specific period of focus from the 1950s to the 1970s, a time when many people of color worldwide strived for racial equality. So during this period, what we see is the civil rights movements in the United States and growing activism in the global South, where many fought for independence from Western powers, resulting in the collapse of global colonial empires from Africa to Asia. And it's really in this historical context when we see growing efforts among people of color to foster unity across racial and cultural backgrounds, such as through Pan-Africanism, which is understood as a global movement that seeks to find unity based on common struggles, such as racism among African descendant people. Baha'i beliefs about racial equality, combined with these larger historical and political context, is the rich background in which the subjects I focus on expanded understandings of a global Pan-Africanism, plural, uniting people of color. In so doing, they fostered this optimism, this hopeful outlook about Africa and forthcoming lasting global harmony. So I make a larger multi-layered argument in my second book project. First, that their mission work, not just Baha'i, was one that was about racial equality and breaking racial boundaries, and also one that was based on breaking gender and ethnic boundaries and championing Africa's cultural renewal and its critical role as a leader in global human unity. Many made marriages across cultural lines, as well as diverse relationships across Western Africa. My second argument is that their project was about diaspora building through upward social mobility, but through a religion that happens to be the Baha'i faith. Their desire for upward social mobility becomes part of the process of facilitating their unique and diverse networks. This second book project draws from history to contribute to scholarship on the African diaspora, Pan-Africanism, and racial politics. It provides essential and key historical insights into modern day conversations about global racial harmony, diasporic experiences, transnational living, and global belonging in our increasingly connected world. In today's context of global Black Lives Matter activism, for instance, look into the racialized experiences and relationships that sprang up during anti-colonial movements in the global South and civil rights movements of the mid-20th century I believe, really invites important reflection about racial equality and harmony, as well as human equality and rights. So I want to step back a bit and provide additional historical context, which shaped my subject's racial politics. Although this is not a religious history project, Baha'i in its tradition of challenging racial and gender inequality common in the Christian faith, Islam, and state colonial institutions, as well as its Iranian leaders' emphasis on unity with people of color worldwide, is a context for examining my subject's transnational politics. The Baha'i faith calls for world unity based on the understanding that all religions, so those that believe in one God, share similar spiritual foundations, and they consider Jesus and Muhammad to have been prophets. The faith's global appeal can be tied partly to its core beliefs in racial and gender equality, religious and cultural tolerance, and world peace and unity. It can also be attributed to the fact that Black people had the chance to take leadership roles in expanding the faith. Enoch Olinga, for example, reached the faith's second highest position in 1957. In this capacity, he traveled to all African countries and eventually every single continent. So he traveled to the US, Mexico, India, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. His female counterparts, such as those that I focus on for today's talk, also found different ways to access various forms of power and social importance through their travels on behalf of the faith. I really see this project as expanding our definition of the African diaspora, specifically decentering Western locales and perspectives on diaspora. Baha'i believers created small transient diaspora communities across Western Africa, and their experiences offer larger insights into new dynamics of transnational diasporic histories and the racial politics that emerged at that time, including expanded ideas about Blackness, Africanness, racial harmony and equity, and global South activism. So really briefly, I want to address the importance of the project. This is a transnational history project, meaning that it examines the circulation of ideas and people across national boundaries. Generally, studies on the internal movement of Africans are anchored or tied to the migrant and refugee experience, focusing on forced movements. Instead, my work focuses on the voluntary movements, exploring new ideas about African diasporic experiences and complicating easy reductions of the African diaspora to histories and racial politics outside of the US, outside of Africa. The transnational histories I share complicate narratives about the African diaspora and settler identities, urging us to ask, who is part of the African diaspora? As the late historian Colin Palmer pointed out in 1998, after what he describes as at least 2 decades of the term's existence, quote, no one has really attempted a systematic and comprehensive definition of the term African diaspora. And he asked, quote, what demographic, temporal, or other boundaries should be imposed on the concept? He queried, does it simply refer to Africans abroad? That is to say, the peoples of African descent who live outside of their ancestral continent? Is Africa a part of the diaspora? Expanding our definition of the African diaspora, it challenges us to rethink the historical persecution and desire to recover roots that typically define African diasporic experiences and relationships. Transnational histories of African descendant people have mostly focused on American and European concerns with Africa. In this project, I want to invert the more common diaspora gaze that looks inward to Africa by focusing on diverse people of African descent, engaging the diaspora and looking outward and on interactions between the diverse racial minorities. Emphasizing these historical links highlights the various understandings of Pan-Africanisms, once again plural, showing how people of color have connected and also envisioned unity beyond race historically. Like most transnational works, this project draws from research across large spatial scales and time periods. I draw from diverse sources, including archival research and oral interviews in Cameroon. You see my research assistant here in the picture, and he is on Zoom now. In the United States, also in Ghana. And I also draw from autobiographies, radio and television interviews, and documentaries. So a bit more on my oral sources. I just want to say that I interviewed descendants of the first people who became Baha'i in West Africa. And I also received already completed transcribed interviews of many of the first Baha'is in Cameroon from my research assistant, Ina Tani, who had been actually conducting and transcribing these interviews long before I met him. And he graciously shared these interviews with me. I also use digital sources, which included online message boards and forums, social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, and digital archives made by individuals worldwide. I also use what I would consider non-conventional methods and sources, such as published conversational travel memoirs, which was useful for the women who could not read or write. I also drew from diverse types of oral sources, such as those pertaining to dreams and to gossip. Finally, I also physically retraced the travel paths that the women of focus took and the towns that they lived in Cameroon, in Ghana, as well as using memorial death websites such as findagrave.com, a website where people add information to the site by walking through a cemetery and taking pictures and posting them online. I found that these sources, particularly oral interviews and the conversational traveler memoirs, I found them to be very useful. These diverse sources allowed me to better emphasize the raw, everyday moments of diaspora building and the desire for upward social mobility that becomes part of the process of facilitating and shaping diverse networks across Western Africa for my project's subjects. The project comprises of 7 micro histories. I've written 3 or 4 chapters by now, and 7 chapters. Each of the chapters actually focuses on the experience of one Baha'i of African descent to highlight larger themes as well as the stories of other individuals. Drawing from literary methods, I link the end of each chapter to the beginning of the next chapter through diverse forms of connections and anecdotes, a geographic place, a shared memory, a dreams remembered, a shared adventure, a close friendship. Thus, the form demonstrates the mobility of the connections that I examine, individualizing the experiences and showing how diverse people of African descent communicated, built relationships, and shared ideas and experiences. With my remaining time, what I want to do now is highlight the 2 chapters from the book that I'm currently writing, that of African-born women and their Black American counterparts who traversed West Africa from the 1950s to the 1970s. Although both groups of women had their own unique experiences, I want to highlight 3 themes that connect their histories and their travels. The first one is the health of belonging, specifically in different spaces and cultures across large spatial scales. I examine the negative and positive sides. So for the negative, I look at the loneliness, the anxiety and fear from racism and issues of being Black in various spaces, and anxiety and fear that is related to issues of gender. But on a more positive side, I also examine how seeing oneself, one's face, language, clothing, and other spaces outside of the Western world, such as in Africa, increase a sense of one's identity and self-esteem. I also look at issues of intellectualism. Often when we think about intellectualism, it's related to book knowledge and to certain people, political activists, philosophers, and so on. But I want to capture a broader realm of intellectualism that narratives on West African intellectual tradition do not typically look at. So I also look at the book smart, so formal education, but also intellectualism that stems from, for example, being able to memorize whole books and whole stories at a time and being able to actually share those. And of course, as a gender historian, I cannot escape issues of maternalist politics. So the women in focus wielded their maternal power, the symbol of what it means to be a mother, whether or not they were actually one, to shape new understandings of Africanness, Blackness, and diasporic experiences and identities in mid-20th century West Africa. This maternalist politics was both overt and subtle in formal structures and also in everyday life, such as domestic spaces and within marriages. The power of motherhood, or the symbol of motherhood, offered different paths to social, political, and religious authority for the woman of focus. As we might already know, the personal is political, a phrase coined by Carol Hanish, a feminist activist, who argued that many personal experiences of women can be traced to one's location within a system of power relationships. Through the above themes and key issues, the women's lives offer one historical viewpoint of how individuals of color propose an alternative message and avenue towards racial equity and international peace that I really believe went beyond their religious stance and also across racial boundaries. So Esther dreams, so full disclosure, my research assistant was here. Esther is his mother. So Esther dreams African women's life across borders. Behind women like Cameroonian woman Esther Tani, Enoch Olinga's wife Elizabeth Olinga, and traveling nurse Hannah Ashu, and other Ghanaian women that I have interviewed here were unusual as women traveling long distances during the period of focus. Their experiences, I believe, highlight the role that gender plays in shaping unity and identity. And so from each of these chapters that what I want to do is actually highlight a few of these women's lives. So that's Esther Tani that you see on the screen with her, also with her husband, David Tani. Esther was known to have many dreams that came to fruition according to the oral interviews that I have conducted in Cameroon and also here in Ghana, and also according to herself and her children. And one famous dream, she recounted that early in her marriage, she had dreamed that she and her family had traveled to foreign lands. She would share these dreams with her husband, David, when they were living in Cameroon. But he would just dismiss the idea, not taking her dreams seriously. But according to what she shared with her son Enoch decades later, his father had remarked that there was not the slightest chance of such a thing ever happening. After her husband David had traveled abroad to French Togoland, and she later joined him there, Esther called him over to her one day, and she asked him if he still believed that the dreams she used to have of them traveling to foreign lands were figments of her imaginations, and he was silent. But there they were in Lomo, living a new life abroad. She would recount this moment time and time again when the family moved throughout French Togoland and also throughout Ghana. For you see, Esther had dreamed the adventure of a lifetime, the dreams leaping from her night's sleep and unfurling into reality. But life abroad was not easy at all, and her mental and physical wellness at times suffered from the pursuit of traveling and living in new places. So for instance, in trying to establish these transient communities in French Togoland and also in northern Ghana, Esther faced severe xenophobia from her female neighbors because she follows slightly different gender norms. And at one time, she was actually physically beaten up. And she talks a bit about how all of these mental hardships really resulted in her suffering from depression and also physical ailments. Yet she went from seeing herself as a perpetual foreigner and an illiterate Cameroonian woman to a powerful maternal force in West African communities, such as in Togo and in Ghana. Although Esther was not literate, she was known, based on the various oral interviews that I conducted, to have an amazing memory. And she could memorize whole books in her mind and share whole books and passages with friends and visitors who did not even need to consult books around her. She also published some of her travel memoirs by speaking the passages to her husband and to her son, and they were transcribed and published them on her behalf with her name written as the author. She helped plan various women's conferences and gatherings throughout Western Africa, such as, I believe there was one in Lagos. And these conferences were really centered around discussion around issues of gender equality. So a few more images with Esther. You see her here with her and her husband helping to clear land for their communities that they're establishing. You see Esther here in the corner dancing, actually with someone that I ended up interviewing later on. She was known as Mama Esther Tanyi, and you see her in the corner of her and her neighbors in Tamale in 1957. And you have here in this image with me and Enoch Tanyi, my research assistant, who is also a research subject himself. And this picture is in Yaoundé, Cameroon. And here is one of the traveling or the conversational traveling memoirs that she published. We were happiest when pioneering. And okay, and we have here another one. I call her Auntie B, who is in her 80s today. She did not reveal her age to me, but she has a very fascinating life. Auntie B traveled throughout all of Africa, specifically Western Africa. And she spoke to me at length about how she took part of her education in the US in the 1950s. And she spoke at length about the severe racism that she encountered. And despite the fact that the US government gave her paperwork to stay in the US for life, she explained to me that she could not stay and that she was actually becoming depressed being Black in the US. And she realized, you know what, Africa is a place to be. That's where my mental health will be much better. And she traveled throughout Western Africa, helping those in refugee camps. And she also met various African presidents and really fully embraced a Pan-African ideology in which all people of color could be African, meaning those who were Indian born in West Africa or in Africa, those who were Iranian, those who were white, as long as they were born there or had spent a long length of time in Africa, they were African. And there isn't that much known, unfortunately, about Elizabeth Olinga. And so a lot of the information that I know about her are through oral interviews and also images. And she really invokes maternalistic politics in sort of trying to spread the faith's idea about gender equality and racial equality. And those, a lot of the information that I know about her are from Black Americans that I interviewed, who would say time and time again, I returned to my African roots because of her. She gave me African clothes. She encouraged me to visit various places in Africa. My second chapter, Mama Weston, Race, Gender, and Maternal Politics. So in this chapter, I focus, the women that I focus on were all Christians becoming Baha'i, but felt that the Christian faith did not adequately address racial inequality in the US. So many chose to travel to Africa, not only because of their newfound faith, but to quote many of their interviews, to return to their quote unquote true heritage. And I also want to add that all these women were already involved in racial equity activities and in the civil rights movement in one way or another before becoming Baha'i. And they spoke in interviews how being in Africa was like returning home. And they spoke and wrote about how their mental health was better because it was for them better to be Black in Africa than Black in the US. And they spoke about how their mental health or their mentality was one in which they felt more at ease. And although they had to deal with other cultural differences, such as realizing that being a single woman in 1950s Africa looked a bit odd to local Africans, they really felt that it was still worth it living in Africa. And for many of the older women who were not biological mothers, their age, so their post-menopausal stage that they were in, allowed them to evoke maternalistic politics and respect from local people. And along with local African women, they planned conferences on gender equality and racial equality for adult women and also for youths. And they also started this thing where I guess you would call them traveling educational workshops. So they had traveling educational workshops throughout West Africa where they would teach youth and adult women about Black American culture. And then they would take these workshops to the US where they would teach those at predominantly Black schools about the history of Africa. Here we have Mama Wesson, and this is from findagrave.com, where there was lots of comments and memories that people shared about her. So in 1954, Mama Wesson, so Vivian Wesson, who was 59 years old, traveled to West Africa for the first time. She had never traveled outside of the US before. And she shared in an interview in 2006, I quote, "Her desire to go to Togo or to go to Ghana was because it's where my African ancestors came from. Upon arriving on shore, as she would later tell it, quote, I heard in the speech of the people passing by, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who was an African woman. That's where I got my blood. I heard her voice, I heard her accents." Wesson would remain in West Africa for over 30 years, living in Ghana and Liberia and also Sierra Leone. And her invocation of a maternal authority and power really shaped her interactions with local Africans, rooting her identity in local beliefs about the power of motherhood, such that locals really called her Mama Wesson. So I interviewed people Baha'i and non-Baha'i who remembered dining at her home many times, who remembered how much she loved children and how she started youth schools. And they remembered what she looked like, the African clothes that she wore. And one person that I interviewed pointed and said, that's where she lived. That's the home where she actually lived in. And this is her tombstone from findagrave.com. So really briefly, this chapter also tells the stories of many other women that I cannot go to at length. I can only highlight a few more. We have Lucille Davis, who was a journalist for Jet magazine, an African-American magazine in the US. And Davis arrived in Ghana on March 7, 1957, right before the country's Independence Day. And she was one of President Nkrumah's special guests at the Ambassador Hotel, where she met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his wife, James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, many famous people. And she actually told her family the night before she was leaving because they did not want her to go to this, this strange land. And her family was told of her travels on the eve that she flew out. And she said in an interview, quote, "My mother said the family just knew something was wrong with me," unquote. And Davis later married a Ghanaian man and remained in West Africa from the point that she landed there. And she actually died in Accra in 2006. So Elsie Austin, she lived in Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, Liberia, Morocco, and she at the time was very much involved with the civil rights movement in the US. And she was an American attorney. She became Minnie First, the first Black attorney in Ohio, first Black attorney general. I mean, she broke many grounds. And she talks in an interview how her attraction to the pursuit of racial equality really began at an early age. So Elsie Austin was sent to an all-Black primary school, but she was sent to a mostly white school. And she explains that on the first day of school, the teacher shared from a history book that the contributions to human civilization was made only by few racial groups, and they left out those who were Black. And the book plainly stated that not only had the Black race made no significant contribution to the lives of humans, but in fact had played a lower role to the more prominent races. And I want to play for you an audio clip of her responding to her classmates and teacher. And I think she was, I don't remember how old she is, maybe 14. Oh. I don't think I can, okay, let me see if I can play it from here then. I think I can play it from here. Oh, there's no, okay. Okay, it's actually okay. What I will do is just summarize what her response was, and I support to know she was not nice. You know what? I've been to all Black primary schools, and I know that Africans and Black people have contributed much. Okay, perfect. Okay.
Can you imagine 2 little Black girls in a school full of white children, in a classroom full of... Two little Black girls in a school full of white children, in a classroom full of white children. And with all the candor and cruelty of the young, the entire class looked at us. And there were, of course, a few snickers and grins. It was then that I remembered my grandmother. I felt as if the Klan was standing there with the guns trained on me. With great resentment and resolve, I stood up and said, I was taught in a Black school that Africans worked iron before Europeans knew anything about it. I was taught that they knew how to cast bronze in making statues, and that they worked in gold and in ivory so beautifully that the European nations came to their shores to buy their carvings and statues. That's what I was taught in a Black school.
We'll pause there. So that gives you a sense of sort of where she's getting her ideas about racial equality from. And she takes those ideas to Western Africa. Oh. We have Valerie Wilson, who was very well known throughout Western Africa, particularly when you look at the history of the High Faith. And I actually hesitated whether or not I should use her as an example, just because there's so much on her. So she was in Liberia for an extensive amount of time, was friends with President Tubman, and she was a physical therapist there and really worked with a lot of elite Africans, helping them with their physical ailments. And she also had traveling educational workshops about racial and gender equality, and very much worked closely with other African women. Her story is very fascinating because she was constantly called white. As you can tell in a minute, she's very, very light-skinned. And so at one point, I believe over a dinner, President Tubman thought she had actually insulted him, and he actually takes her visa away and tries to kick her out of the country. And according to the letters and the sources other sources that I found, he referred to her as white. He said, this white woman insulted me. And so what's really fascinating about her is in her letter, she constantly talks about how being in Africa was one way in which she could reaffirm her Blackness. One way in which she could really feel that she was a Black person and an African person. And so it's really also ironic in a bit when she's engaging with local Africans, and in their letters, in their oral interviews, they constantly say, but she was a white woman. So you see this sort of conflict. And here are some letters. I do want to mention that I have over 5,000 handwritten letters. It's one of those cases where I don't know what to include and what to exclude. And the 5,000 are just what I managed to photocopy in the archives. There is much, much more. And last, we have Eloise Mitchell, who was in Accra, and here we have some images of her with her neighbors, her neighbor's child, and she also traveled in other places outside of Ghana. She was a traveling teacher, so she would travel to various parts of Western Africa to teach about racial equality, gender equality. She was in Cameroon. And she also embraced other local African women and also traveled with them as well. And once again, you have online memorial websites, which proved to be very helpful to me. And you know, when you're even looking at people are sharing their memories about her, you can sort of get a sense of where they're from, the things that they remembered about them. From one of the women that I looked at, you can see where they're logging in from, and it's from all over the world to discuss their memories. So to conclude, the experiences and histories of the people I examine provide essential historical insights, really into these contemporary ideas about racial harmony and equality, living across borders, and also what does it mean to be a Black person in the diaspora? Is it only a Black person in the US and within Western settings? Does it also mean crossing the borders in Africa? Do you have to leave the continent? And so their stories really invite important reflection about racial equity and harmony yesterday and today. And as I explore the everyday joys and pains and the challenges of these women, their stories have brought a new type of connection, a new type of feeling of home and belonging that I, as a researcher, have not experienced before in African archives and oral interviews. I admire the women who are the subject of my second book project. I connect to their drive and their independence and willingness to change the world and seek racial equality on a global level, really a fight that is long from over. And their stories really or ultimately remind us how much more work there is to do to achieve racial equity and global harmony, but also the roles that women of color have played and the way they have played them in different ways. So I end this talk by reflecting upon Elsie Austin's closing words. Here we have Elsie Austin. And she gave a really long interview at the, I think she actually passed. And she ends this interview discussing about how we should continue to strive for peace and racial harmony. And she said, quote, "I don't know what we're waiting for, but we should be galvanized into action because now is the time. As the saying goes, if not now, then when?" Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for that interesting presentation. Every once in a while, I wish that I had become an historian. Today is one of those days. I'm going to open it up to all of us to share our comments and questions. Since I have the mic, I'm going to take the opportunity and be the first questioner. And I am curious to know a bit more about the ways in which the African and African-American women worked together around, you at some point you mentioned the word xenophobia, and I wasn't sure who was expressing this xenophobia against whom, and how, what kind of partnership existed among these women. just reminded of when Ari Lennox came to Ghana last year and the whole furore around her expression of her feeling of having come home and how she found, soul connection. And then the way some people lambasted her for, you are an American, you're actually not African, and you don't know our pain here. And then the other people lambasted and said, well, Ari Lennox is not to be blamed if your country is not doing well. Go and blast Nanado, But in all of that, I'm using this example. We didn't see the conversations, right? So that's what I'm curious about. So I'll take a few questions, so you can park that one. So let me take a few more from the. Do we have a mic? Wow. Okay, great. So one hand. Yes. Oh, okay. All right. And then you can just pass.
This is just a quick question about migration or shared travel experiences. So to what degree is this kind of time spent together in the van, the crucial bonding experience that creates the conditions for what you're calling racial harmony? That's the first part. And then the second part, and maybe that responds to the xenophobia question too. So the shared sense that they're the recipients of this experience as outsiders. But the second part is, what does racial harmony mean? And you referenced a kind of theological benchmark within the Baha'i faith. But then what does it come to mean among the people that you're studying?
Yeah, thank you very much. I can relate my question to yours. I also wondered what traveling does and means in this context. And also, I had the impression that some of the travels were, say, directed by the women, yes, and others were just a kind of women being open to travel and then taking opportunity. And the third is also related to traveling. Some of the women, I understood, accompanied their husbands while these were traveling, doing their, say, professional trajectory. And I think this is very important as well, that people traveling are always as well connected in their, where they come from, all these different kinship relations, not only the husband, but also maybe children would either travel or not. And I wonder which place these questions take in your reflections on belonging.
We'll let her answer, and then I'll take another round. So.
Thank you for these great questions. I'm actually furiously writing notes so I can further reflect on them. The issue of xenophobia, I've had to really think about how I want to write this carefully, because the women that I am looking at, they're not living in specials, they're living in the community. And so there are a lot of people that they're interacting with are not of their faith. And they're being asked time and time again, where are you from? Why are you here? Why are you a single woman? So answer another one of the questions. Esther was actually out of the norm for traveling with her husband. All the women that I look at are all traveling by themselves. The African-born ones and also the ones from the US. And so the xenophobia comes in everyday experiences. And one example I can give is Esther Dhani would one day was actually for several months was washing her husband's clothes and hang them out to dry. And her neighbors in Tamale actually came and physically beat her up. And they said, we don't wash our husband's clothes here. And so our husbands are coming home asking us to wash their clothes. You're adding more labor on us. And so, in the sources that I was looking at, it became very clear that these are about everyday sort of living, how you greet your neighbor, different cultural differences that all of these women had to deal with. And it wasn't all a rosy picture. Some returned home. Some said, I can't do this. The cultural difference is too much for me. And so that's where you see the xenophobia sort of playing a role. But the maternalistic politics for many of these women, opening their homes up to the community, to children, to other women, allow them another way to access people in their community and to build bridges by essentially showing that, okay, I may be from a different space, but I also embrace key ideas about gender norms, particularly motherhood. And that was one way in which they can build bridges. And I think there was one question about what does traveling mean, traveling together, and what racial harmony means. In terms of traveling, there are hundreds of letters, which I would actually say are travel memoirs, where all they do is talk about traveling. And, you know, I just didn't realize that, you know, in some ways, traveling across Africa today is harder than it was for the people in the 1950s. And in some ways, it is easier. But they talk at length about where they had to catch a taxi, a ferry, a boat, all sorts of situations. So to go from Cameroon to to go to Tamale, I mean, for many of these people, they write letters upon letters how terrible and horrible the trip was, because it wasn't a direct route, and they didn't always have all this money to be, I guess you would say, traveling first class back then. And so, yes, traveling in many ways together created this bond of, you know, of this sort of very difficult traveling that is occurring. And Esther Tani traveled as much as her husband. And in her memoir, she talks about how traveling throughout, you know, French Togoland, Ghana, the actual physical danger she put herself in, the rivers with crocodiles, you know, and like not being able to swim. And so at first I didn't pay attention to these. And I realized they're saying something different and something new about what does it mean to be mobile within Western Africa. But I do think that in some ways for them, you know, it was easier to go across borders then. And racial harmony, ideas about racial harmony was different for those who are Black Americans and for those who were born in Africa. When I interview people born in Africa, I would ask about issues about race, and they would say, well, that, you know, well, I'm very confused. Why are you talking about race here? But then in conversations, it became clear that the way they were envisioning race was very different. For them, a lot of the times it was about intercultural marriages. So marrying other Black people outside of their town and home, marrying Black Americans. If you were from Ghana, marrying someone from Cameroon. And so that was one of the ways in which race really played a really large role into their racial politics. And I remember Auntie B told me at one time, she said, growing up, you didn't even marry someone from the next village over. Your family would protest. They would say, there's a funeral, there's something happening. How are you going to easily come home? And so she talked very much at length about these intercultural marriages with other ethnic groups in Ghana and also neighboring countries. And we have Ina Tanya, my research assistant here, and they lived in Ghana for a long time. And she would tell me, you know what, the Tanya family married local Ghanaians. They are Ghanaians to me, not people from Cameroon. Oh, the sisterhood solid. Yeah. Together.
So I'm hearing that people have come from somewhere, the US, and they are in communities, they're doing work for children and so on. But my question is there a solidarity movement, for want of a better word? Are these women working together? We've got Esther, who's, you know, has her understanding of the Baha'i movement and working with others. And then you've got the, you know, the others like, can't read my own handwriting, so the names, but you get that. Are they working in collaboration around issues of faith or race or, you know, this whole notion of belonging?
Thank you.
Sorry, and those of you online, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and I'll read them out.
Excellent question. Yes, these women were definitely working together, and I know from the various pictures that those that I've interviewed have shared with me. Not only are they working together, but like what Ebony was saying, they're actually traveling together to go to Lagos, Mali, Liberia, and so on, to hold these workshops and to hold these conferences together. Now, this is where I need to be careful about what I write, and I will concede and say that there's a sense of hierarchy. Who's funding these trips? It's the Black American women oftentimes who are funding these trips. A lot of times these women are able to travel because you have Mao Weston, for example, who is saying, oh, I met a woman from Cameroon and I want to travel with her. And so she's paying for this. It's their money that is essentially allowing them or giving them the opportunity to travel. And it does, in many circumstances, cause tension. Because there are times where they're having conferences in North Africa, in London, and you need to choose someone to represent the group. And oftentimes the local African women want to travel, but it's an issue about money. Unless you can get someone to sponsor you, there's limitations in your traveling and solidarity as well.
Thank you. So there was a hand next to Ebony. Yes. We can.
Yes, thank you very much. Wait, my question had been partly answered because it was about the way you use it, the definition you give to the word race. Because you did question the term diaspora and wonder what are the frontiers, and I was wondering, so to go a bit further, I was wondering about the language, because I mean, there are some concepts which can be maybe translated as race in different languages, but which has many different meanings, maybe. So I was wondering if you, in which language, if you were interacting with different languages, and if you have this in your data.
Is there another hand? Okay.
Thank you so much for that question. Okay, so I want to be very blunt, and I want to share that one of the key tenets of the Baha'i faith is education. In fact, to the point where there's often sort of this emphasis that if you have a son and a daughter and you can only educate one, the head of the faith in 1950 said, educate the daughter over the son. And this means that a lot of the Baha'is that I'm looking at are highly educated. Professors, doctors, lawyers, formally educated. And though their language that they are discussing in is in English. And we also have French, and you also have Farsi, so which is the language for Iran. So they're engaging in different languages across Western Africa and across the world. And their language that they are, or the word that they're using, no matter what language they are speaking in, is race. And the reason why race becomes a really important sort of terminology is that they're working with the United Nations. And one of the things that they really do is that they they actually succeed in implementing Race Amity Day. And Race Amity Day is a day in which it celebrates racial equality. And so the language of the United Nations at that time, it is English. And that is the language, and those are the terms that they are using to understand what race means. Now, for those who are, many of those that in Cameroon or in Ghana, when I bring up race, they're not seen in the same way that those who are, in Europe or in the US. It's more like those are issues that Americans have to deal with. Our issue here is something else. But you do deal, and I don't want to make assumptions, because Auntie B, who I showed you before, who's, I guess she's 85, is really well-versed in global politics. And she told me at one point, I thought when I made the decision to leave the US in the 1950s, I thought I second-guessed that decision for a really long time. And she said, but look at what's happening now. And she said, I absolutely made the right decision. decision. And so these people that I'm looking at are really well-versed in global politics, and they're aware, and this is the language that they are using. Now, whether or not it becomes important to their everyday life is a different situation.
Thank you. Yes, Apna. And do I see any other hand? No. Okay.
Thank you, Jackie, for such a wonderful and stimulating talk. I just have one question, and that was the premise you started with, Esther's dream. I love, as a historian, I love this idea of using dreams as one of the many sources of information. Do you have any other examples of people's dreams kind of permeating the logic of your research?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Mine, I've heard you mention a place named Tamale. I was curious to whether in terms of place names and meanings, because there is a city in Ghana, in the northern region, it's also Tamale. There is contestations about its meaning. Some are rendering it as the meaning local. So I want to see whether there is historical connection, or if you know the meaning of Tamale in Uganda, you can share with us.
Actually, I think it was Tamale in Ghana, but you can correct me. I'm going to read a question from someone online who says, thank you for a very fascinating and insightful lecture. Can you please shed some light on the views of these women on indigenous African religion, considering their religious faith, and what it meant for relationships across the divide?
Thank you so much. Tamale, I was referring to the tamale in Ghana. I do not know the connections, but I do know that there was a town here. It's escaping my mind, but I'm going to remember, which has the same name as a famous town in Cameroon, where this town in Cameroon is mostly Baha'i. So I've asked lots of people where the name or the origin comes from, and they're not very clear yet. I apologize, I forgot what the other question, oh, dreams. Amina, this one was, there were dreams all over the place. And I had to really be careful about this because, you know, as a historian and those who do oral history, you can sometimes get into trouble by saying, well, it's not fact, it's not the proper source. Esther, her son actually wrote a biography on her and had like several chapters just dedicated to her dreams. And time and time again, the issue of dreams comes over and over again. And I'm still trying to grapple with the larger meaning. And a lot of it is connected to the faith, where I dreamt that Inakalinga, this mysterious African, was going to come, right? But I didn't know what that means. Several years later, a mysterious African man arrives. And so it's just one of these things that comes up time and time again. I've never worked with dreams as a primary source before, and I'm still thinking it through. And I've been very careful on how much I use it. I actually hesitated, but maybe the question is making me think maybe I should just move forward and really jump forward. The next one is a little bit sensitive, indigenous religions. I have talked at length about that and have been how the Baha'i faith in Africa is a little different from how it's practiced in the US. And I've had people in the US come up to me and say, no, that's not true. That's not possible. That's not how it is practiced here. And I'm just like, well, in the oral interviews I have done, it is Baha'ism is slightly understood in a different way. And there are times where it's very much connected to indigenous beliefs and cultures, much like, you know, being Christian and also, you know, bringing in local traditional beliefs into your religious or spiritual world views. And you definitely have that with Baha'ism. And the group of people that I'm specifically looking at in Cameroon were actually known to switch their religion based on the political context. And so when it was under German colonialism, they were Protestant. the Germans lose the war, and they're like, well, you know what, we're gonna be traditional now. And then the French and the British go back to being Protestant. And so they're known to have shifted based on the circumstances. So you have had historians that state it actually makes complete sense that when the Baha'i faith arrives, that they're like, okay, you know what, I think this works for me because as a Protestant, I'm not getting jobs. I went to this missionary school and there are no jobs. And here comes the faith giving me money to travel and to support my family while I'm abroad. I don't want to minimize the faith because people, join or have or have, religious outlooks based on various reasons. But that's one reason in which they are very much attracted to the faith.
Thank you. Take a couple more before we bring the curtain down. Going, gone. Okay. Do you have any last words for us? Something that you wanted to get in and somehow escaped you? You can say no.
No, just thank you for your questions, because right after this, I'll be revising my chapters. So thank you, thank you.
So a very big thank you from all of us and from everyone online, I'm sure, to Jacqueline for this presentation. We will be looking forward to the final product. Journal apps for, no, I thought the book project is done. Oh, this is a book project in progress. Okay, all right. I was going to make a plea for you to give it to us for our journal. No, you will take the book, but I was going to make a plea. Can we have it for our journal? But okay, so never mind. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for, there's a question? Okay, we will take that question. Can you make it a little brighter? Can you draw on some of the women? Let me go to the familiar. Oh, it's gone off. All right. Can you draw on some of the women's experiences to complicate and at the same time illuminate interconnections between notions of home and belonging? Okay, all right, she likes that. So that's the grand finale question from, the earlier question was from Dr. Edem Adote, the one on religion. And this one is from Professor Abo-Bedo. Okay, there's one, and this will be the very last question from Jilly Philippa, which says, thank you for the insightful presentation. I'm curious to know about the gender norms and practices in Baha'i faith. If you want to take that. Are they reinforcing the same gender norms as other religion, or it is different? I guess some of them are different. At least we heard you say something on education, but over to you.
In terms of the gender norms in the Baha'i faith, just like other religions, there's also people are following also the local cultural values. So Baha'ism is about gender equality and so on, but at the grassroots level, oftentimes they're also following, the patriarchal expectations about how you behave at home as a woman and what a man does. Now, I don't have any stats, but one thing that I did see was this emphasis on that daughters go to school, that daughters are educated. I don't know if it's because I'm interviewing them and I'm asking them questions, and this is why they're emphasizing that, but this is what I saw time and time again. Now, to me, there was no difference between interviewing a Baha'i woman who's cooking, cleaning while I'm interviewing her and someone who's Christian or Muslim. Auntie B was quite busy when I was interviewing her. So that's what I'll just say for that one. Notions of home and the nation. I mean, as a gender historian, for me, the home represents the nation writ large. What happens at home between the relationship between husband, wife, the role that everyone plays, I think represents what the nation is on the larger level. And so I do think that in terms of how women should behave and how they should act, does sort of shape ideas about what the nation is. Now, it's really hard for me to go into great details about this because the women that I'm looking at are traveling to other cultures and other countries. And I'm a historian of Cameroon. So there's only so much that I can say about Nigeria, Ghana, and what they were sort of envisioning about what the nation looks like at the larger level. What I can tell you is what the response was at the national level. And so if we look at Ghana, for example, before Baha'is arrived, they had to get permission from, from the president and so on to be there. And they had to explain what the religion is and what their purpose is. And because Baha'is can't engage in partisan politics, in many places they were welcomed with open arms. And okay, you don't believe, okay, you're not going to vote. Okay, everything is, you just go along with, everyday life and you're not going to cause problems. Welcome. And so for me, looking at this connection is really about what are the women doing at the grassroots level. And a lot of it is connected to issues related to women and to gendered issues. I mean, I could speak more about Cameroon, which gets a bit more complicated in terms of what the nation is. Yeah. So, the person online, thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. We thanked you already, so we shan't thank you again. But thank you so much. That was really fascinating for me. A couple of announcements, and then I'll pass it over to you for your announcements. So this, most of you will know that the University of Ghana is celebrating its 75th anniversary. And among other things, we've been having public lectures. This evening, we have one at 4 o'clock in the CD House. The speaker is Mr. Manasseh Azuriawuni, who's editor-in-chief of the Fourth Estate. Those of you who follow Ghanaian politics will recognize him as someone who's unearthed a lot of, what is the appropriate word, scandals. Especially in the political space, whichever political space and how you measure it. So should be very interesting. Our chair for this evening is Justice Sophia Kufu, who is chairperson of council, who has recently come out to tell us that she's ungagged and so therefore can speak her mind about anything. So it should be very interesting. And on Monday, we have a conversation between Akosua Hansen, who's a reporter with YFM, and Manifest, the musician. So that should be also very interesting. It's at 5 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock, there's an animation film called February 28th, and that speaks to the February 28th event. So you're all very welcome this evening's Manasseh's talk is also going to be streamed live on YouTube as well. Manifest. So you're encouraged to spend your anniversary of Ghana mood on these two events.
All right, thank you very much. Let me start by even saying a very big thank you to Prof for sparing some time to do this for us. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And to our speaker, yeah, it was wonderful, as expected. So thank you very much for coming through, and we hope to see you very soon. Yeah, and to our in-house persons, thank you as usual and as always. And online, we also say thank you. Next week, we have 2 presentations. So on the 9th, we have a presentation titled Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Artificial Intelligence for Drug Discovery. And this is by Dr. Samuel Kojukufi of the University of Ghana. That is on the 9th, Thursday. And on Friday, we have a special seminar. So we have a book presentation titled Central Banking in Ghana and the Governance, Institutional Growth and Development. So the seminar, as usual, will be at 12 noon on Thursday, but this special seminar will be at 10 a.m. on Friday, here in the seminar room and also online. I will send the information as usual. And please, if you are here and you are not on our email list and you want to be receiving emails, kindly let me have your contact and I will add you. I'll gladly add you to our list and you will receive message. So thank you once again for coming through. And we hope to see you on Thursday and on Friday. And on Friday, you will see Prof right here in the chair again. So please come around. All right, thank you.
And today and Monday's lectures are not at the Great Hall, but at the CD House, the Economics Banking Bank of Ghana building. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day and weekend. And happy anniversary if we don't, well, anniversary, I don't know about happy, but anniversary.